welcome to the Fruity Knitting Podcast. This is episode 48 and I'm Andrea.
I'm Andrew. We love all of our shows, but we're really excited today to be presenting a very special project. In our interview today, we'll be talking to Susan Crawford, who is just releasing her latest book, Vintage Shetland.
Yes. Susan's probably best known for her reinterpretations of vintage knitwear, particularly through her series of A Stitch in Time. But her latest book, Vintage Shetland, is so much more than just a collection of knitting patterns. It's a real collector's item. It's a book full of the stories behind some very remarkable garments, and these garments show the very creative and ingenious knitting skills of the Shetland knitters roughly in the period of 1920 to 1950. And in the interview, Susan talks about her experience of studying these garments, of designing replicas from the garments, but also of exploring and discovering the stories of the knitters themselves who knitted the garments and the people who wore them. So it's very interesting.
Totally fascinating, that interview. We're going to be traveling to St. Louis, Missouri to meet Karen as our guest on Knitters of the World. We've got a short tutorial and we're also giving you an update on our own projects.
Yes.
So we're starting with under construction with me. This is my new project. I am zooming along on this project. It uses a DK weight yarn, which is a big change after doing fingering weight socks for you, and then going on to my sports weight sock yarn for the brioche project, which really does seem to take twice as long as normal knitting. So that's that. The yarn is Langsund, which is Donna Smith's very own yarn, made from her very own Shetland sheep. It's beautiful.
In a natural grey.
A natural grey, which matches my very own natural grey.
Yes.
This is, which is an extraordinary thing. This vest is going to match me more and more over time.
Yes.
That's quite an achievement, I reckon. I like the pattern. It's quite a simple pattern. Andrea made this up. As you heard last week, we saw the swatch. I don't know if you want to show the swatch. We showed the swatch last week, and Andrea talked about designing me a vest, which she was very excited about. There was a moment of deflation during the week where Andrea, whilst browsing in Ravelry, discovered a pattern, a vest, which was pretty much the same as what you had in mind.
Yes.
But was already published.
Exactly, by the great Martin Story. So that was rather crushing. But the whole idea, I wanted a very simple stitch pattern that Andrew could not sweat over.
Handle.
And it's basically a knit 3, purl 3, but every couple of rows you stagger it so that you get these diagonal lines. And my idea was to have it in a mirror form so that you have a diagonal V shapes coming down like that, which I thought would be very flattering on the male form, broadens the shoulders, it narrows the waist. I was feeling very creative and very pleased with myself. And Martin Story has done a vest almost identically to this design, which was quite crushing. He does change it though. He has the V's coming down in the bottom part, but then he inverts the design from the upper chest onwards. So instead of the diagonal lines going this direction, they go that direction, which is a really clever design detail, because in my mind I was thinking, that's all very fine, I can do that, but when it comes to putting in a V-neck, the angle of the V-neck would have to be at the same angle of these lines coming down, or it'll look a bit strange. And he avoids that problem altogether by inverting it from the upper part of the chest, so that the lines are going in to the V-neck.
And then you're free to do the V-neck
however you want.
It should be.
That's very clever. So it's interesting to see how really good designers avoid problems. Yeah. So I was sulking a little bit and thought, well, we'll just knit his pattern then. I won't do my pattern. But then in the end I thought, you know what, my pattern's pretty cool too, and it's not the same. And I was on the front going to put in a centre panel here with a different sort of knit and purl stitch, which was going to help me recreate the V-neck as well. So I thought, okay, now we'll do my pattern, but obviously I'm not going to try to make a pattern out of it for other people to knit, because it's just too close to Martin's design. So after the initial crushing blow, feeling sorry for myself, I did feel quietly self-assured, because I thought, well, you know, I was thinking along the same creative lines as the great Martin Story. So
Yeah.
I
And I
can
think, didn't
pat
you say-
myself on the back.
Yeah, and you found that the gauge that he used
Yes.
was exactly the same as what you figured out.
That was also very reassuring because I spent a fair bit of time because I wanted the stitch pattern to form a certain texture for the vest, and so we kept going down on needle sizes until I was
different needles there.
Exactly, until I was satisfied. And I thought, oh, this is probably tighter than what a lot of people would knit, but I think it creates a better fabric. And Martin Story thought so too, because his gauge is exactly the same as what I picked. So I found that very reassuring.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you an update on my Sumfree. It's a design by Marie Wallen from her Shetland collection. Here is a picture of it here so you can see what it looks like. It's a gorgeous design. It uses the Jamiesons of Shetland Spindrift yarn. 14 different shades are used. They're all beautiful heathery colours. And even though the design is quite a bold pattern on it, because they're heathery colours, they all melt into each other and it has quite a subtle, harmonious effect, which I really love. So even though it's a beautiful design, it has been a very cursed project for me. I've had quite a lot of ripping out to do on this project, so it has mixed feelings for me. So I did mention this to you in the last episode, so I'm not going to say too much about it now. But the first thing that I had to do was rip out the whole body. So I'll just very briefly go over what I did for that. The design has got a 1x1 rib, quite a long ribbing on the bottom. And that naturally has got negative ease, so it fits close against your body. I had knitted it the first time all the way up to the shoulders and then tried it to the armpits and then tried it on. And I found that that was sitting nicely against my body, but here was way too loose. And so the effect was that it was tight around the hips, but then blousing or gathering out with too much material at the top of the rib. So I ripped right back to the rib again, and I took out a full 10 centimetres just so that there wouldn't be any gathers on the top of the rib on my body type. So I literally have knitted the body twice up to the armholes, which was frustrating to start off with. But I have taken, like I said, 10 centimetres out of here, but naturally I had to start increasing again along the sides to make sure that the top part of it was going to be broad enough, because as you can see in the design, it's a drop shoulder. So I've done that all right.
Have you tried it on again?
Yes, I have, and it looks better.
That's good.
It looks better, so we know that. That's
Right.
good. So the pattern is written in the flat, which means that you would have to be doing a lot of purling back. This pattern in itself is a very long pattern repeat. It's not a short pattern repeat. You've got one chart for the right across the top and then one for the bottom. So it's not a pattern you really want to be purling on, but it's very easy to convert into the round. But now that I'm at the armholes, I need to decide whether I'm going to continue knitting in the round and put in a steek, or if I'm going to just knit the top part of it flat, so the top of the front and the top of the back flat. So I haven't quite decided, but either way, I need to know the measurement for the depth of the armhole. Because the pattern's written in the flat, it doesn't tell you any of this on the schematic, but you can work it out. You need to read through the pattern, you find how many stitches there are at the top of the sleeve. That'll give you the width of the sleeve, and the width of the sleeve will tell you the depth of the armhole. So that's how you can work it out. But I decided, so that I have a really perfect fit, to stop knitting on the body and to start knitting a sleeve. When I finish my sleeve, I will be able to measure it exactly and then do the exact calculations for a perfect fit on my armhole. So this is where my second mistake started, which is really my mistake, my problem. It's I'm to blame for this. So as you know, a sleeve is shaped like this, and I have my big blown up chart in front of me, and there's some green lines on the chart that show you where you are increasing on either side of the sleeve to make it bigger. So I just had the chart in front of me and I'm merrily knitting away, following the chart, following these green lines that show you where to increase on either side. When the green lines stopped increasing, I thought, well, you don't need to increase anymore, and I continued knitting.
Yeah, but the green line stopped altogether.
They stopped altogether, and I assumed that means no more increasing. So I knit my sleeve up to about 5 centimetres before I'm due to be finished. And then it's looking suspiciously narrow, especially since I'd already taken out 10 centimetres out of the bottom of the body. I thought it's not meant to be that much of a close-fitting sleeve.
Yeah.
So then I go back and I read the instructions in the written part, and I see that I was actually meant to increase 20 more stitches beyond where these green lines stopped. Now, because it's Shetland yarn, Shetland wool, it's quite sticky, which is perfect for Ferrare, but it means and there's so many colours involved that to unpick could easily take an hour. So I decided to take my scissors to my knitting and just chop it off so that I can get into the knitting as soon as possible. And there it is. So I chopped it off back down here and have re-knitted, including my increasing. So I can highly recommend taking your scissors to your knitting.
Yeah, but that wasn't just a practical thing, was it, Dals?
It was a therapeutic thing.
It wasn't just to get back to the knitting as quickly as possible. There was a bit of satisfaction in actually taking a blade.
Yes. Yeah. It's very good for frustration and suppressed anger.
Yeah.
Get your scissors out. So I now have this extra something or other, sleeve or wrist warmer. If I need the yarn, I can unpick it, but I think sometimes when you've got a problem like this, it's just better to get straight into the knitting and redo it quickly instead of having to go through the unpicking. That's
on that horse.
Extra painful. Yeah. Get back on the horse.
Yeah. So, I mean, the net result of this, Dals, and this is also going back to something we mentioned in the last episode, is I'm actually making more progress than you are.
Yes, you're a faster knitter than me.
Yeah, you've only made a little bit of progress since the last episode.
That's true.
Yeah. So it's interesting how things develop. It's time now for part 1 of our interview with Susan Crawford. This is a really beautiful interview. We were very lucky when we were in Snowdonia. We travelled up to Cumbria, which is where Susan Crawford has her farm, and we met her there and did the interview. That was a real treat for us, and this interview should be a real treat for you, so enjoy it. We'll be back soon.
Yes.
When I first began researching the knitwear of the early 20th century contained in the Shetland Museum archive over 4 years ago, my only criteria were for the items to be beautiful, unique, and to tell a story, their own story, or to be part of Shetland, its inhabitants, or its knitwear industry. The Vintage Shetland Project tells these tales alongside patterns, created by reading each garment's own knitted story, stitch by stitch, row by row. This task revealed much more than simply how each item was knitted. The more I studied them, the more I fell in love with them. But as I considered why I loved each piece, it occurred to me that in so many of them there was an imperfection, a flaw, sometimes in the knitting, sometimes in the construction, sometimes in the yarns used, but most often because the garment had been washed, worn, loved, repaired, worn more, washed again, shrunk, adapted, repaired again, enlarged, worn more, passed on, loved more. And so each story continued.
Welcome to the Fruity Knitting Podcast. I am so excited and happy to be sitting here with Susan Crawford, who many of you know and admire. We're at her farm in Lancashire in the UK. And Susan is perhaps best known for her reinterpreted vintage knitwear designs in her very successful book series, A Stitch in Time. Susan has worked as a knitwear and fashion designer for many years, and she's also lectured in fashion and fashion history. And her latest book, Vintage Shetland, has just been released. It's a really special project that she's been working on for a very long time, and that's going to be the focus of our interview today. The release of the book was delayed due to Susan's battle with breast cancer, and her very open and honest and direct communication and writing about this ordeal has really been inspiring to many of us in the knitting community. So we might also talk a little bit about that towards the end. So Susan, thank you so much for inviting us to your farm and for coming on the podcast to talk about your latest book.
It's an absolute pleasure, Andrea. It's nice
Good.
to have you here.
So as I said, you're perhaps best known for your vintage knitwear. So maybe we could start there and you could tell us how that developed or how that started.
Yeah. When I was a child, both my grandmothers were needle women. One of them in particular was actually a dressmaker and a seamstress, and in her younger days had made ballroom gowns for people with thousands of sequins all hand sewn on them, and she was one of those people who could turn her hand to absolutely anything. And she was directly responsible in teaching me to knit, to crochet, to sew, to embroider. Literally every handicraft that she knew, she passed on to me. What I hadn't realised was at the same time we were using the patterns that she had from when she was young. So I was knitting from 1940s knitting patterns.
Okay.
And using 1940s and 1950s sewing patterns. And I didn't even realise that was what was happening, or that was different to what other people were doing. So that was sort of the starting point. Then my other grandma, my Betty grandma, she was a bit of a naughty girl. When she used to look after me during the day, quite often she would ring up school for me and tell them that I wasn't well, so that we could stay at home and watch old films. So we used to sit and watch one black and white wonderful film after another and just marvel at the clothes and the construction and how they sat on the actresses and so on. And I must just have absorbed that love of everything of sort of that period. And as I got a bit older and was looking at what to do for a future, I studied fashion and textiles, and also studied hand knitting and pattern cutting and tailoring and anything I could get my hands on really that was to do with clothing and fashion. And everything that I did had some sort of vintage sort of inspiration to it, or it would be clothing that I imagined Barbara Stanwyck or Catherine Hepburn or somebody would want to wear. Yeah. And that was really the starting point. And then it eventually sort of just knitting became the overriding side of it. I became less interested in the sewing and more interested in the knitting.
Yeah, and then you had your book, A Stitch in Time, which is the volume 1.
That's right, yes. This one was not quite a recreation, but it was inspired by a book of the same name that was released in the 1970s by my co-author of this book, which is a lady called Jane Waller. And she had produced a book that was only reprints of vintage knitting patterns. When I was young, I would reference that book because it had beautiful designs in it. However, I used to get very frustrated because it would only be the original pattern, and if you weren't the right size for that vintage pattern, it was more complicated for you to knit it. And also, it only used vintage wool.
Yes.
And it was quite a task to try and figure out sometimes what wool you were supposed to be using. I met Jane by chance one day and we became firm friends, and eventually we decided that with the knowledge that I had and the expertise that I had, I could bring Stitch in Time back to life and reintroduce it to another generation of vintage knitters.
A modern, I was going to say audience, but
Yeah.
yeah, okay. And part of doing that was producing yarns that people can use, wasn't it?
That's right, yes, yes. When we came to do volume 2, this one is slightly different. For a start, it goes 10 years later, but it uses my own collection of vintage knitting patterns in it as well. And in both books, all the patterns are now multi-sized and graded for a whole range of sizes and shapes, whilst keeping the vintage silhouette. I felt it's really important for those designs to remain as true to the originals and to be authentic, and for the shoulders to sit where they should sit and the waist to sit where they should sit, etc.
And that takes a lot of knowledge, doesn't it, to be able to do it across all of the sizes properly?
It does, it really does. And it takes an awful lot of work. Some of the patterns, really, the work that has gone into one individual pattern far outweighs sort of what it is, really. It's just a knitting pattern, but sort of 50, 60 hours later and you've cracked the code. It's extremely exciting to see that pattern actually turn into what you've intended it to be. But so one of the complexities is reproducing them and getting the right weights of yarn and getting the right colours to sort of really recreate that vintage feel. And I had friends, John and Juliet Arbon, who run John Arbon Textiles down in Devon. And we discussed creating a yarn to enable me to reproduce some of the garments. And that's what we have here, which is Exolana, which is the first yarn I created. So John spins the yarn and I have all the colours dyed. And then have it skeined and band it up all here back at the farm.
Because it is important to have the right kind of vintage colour, isn't it?
It really is, yes. Yeah, there's just something about the tones of some of them that are very, very different to today. So this little sweater here, which is one of the wartime farm pullovers, which might be familiar to quite a lot of people. It's been an extremely popular pattern. Just shows you what I mean, really. There's something about the way the colours blend. When I designed the colours, all of them have got a certain amount of grey in there. Although the wool is white, there is a sort of greyness to the actual colour. And that sort of binds them all together, really. So when you then knit them as a palette, you get this really nice sort of, even though you've got quite radically different colours, somehow
they've still got the same hue in a way.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, and Exolana also, as you can see, really lends itself well to colourwork knitting.
Yeah, it's very smooth and beautiful. It does. I think you were saying it wasn't easy to find so many 4-ply yarns even back then.
No, certainly. I mean, we started all of this in 2007, and it's hard to believe now that 4-ply was a hard yarn to come by, but it really was. Certainly in the UK, there was almost only Rowan who were doing a good 4-ply selection, and often the colours were just
not right for vintage.
No, so it was a big step to take, but it's something I've absolutely loved doing. Actually creating yarn and creating colours has been a real added bonus that I hadn't expected when I set out on this. I'm very pleased with it.
So we've got to talk now about the Vintage Shetland book, which has just been released. That's super exciting. So tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind it, and then give us a summary of what it contains.
Right, well, the inspiration really came from the curator of the Shetland Museum, who is a wonderful lady called Carol Christensen, who is very prominent in the organisation of the Shetland Wool Week events. And she is just, her knowledge of Shetland knitting is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And it transpired that she was a fan of my work in the Stitch in Time books, which was absolutely amazing to find out. And we were visiting in 2010, I think it was, and she invited us to the textile section of the museum to go and have a look at the pieces. And then just sort of said, would you like to do something with them? What do you think you could do with them? And so it was very much the ball was in my court, but she wanted me to try and recreate them and come up with a project to surround it. So the idea came to me that we would choose a selection that represented Shetland knitting in all its different facets, but also sort of focused on the early 20th century, which is my particular area of interest. So from about 1920 to sort of the end of the 1950s. To recreate them, to create patterns from the garments, because there are no patterns. They are just straight out of knitters' heads. And also to try and find the stories that are behind the garments, either the ladies who knitted them or the people who wore them, their place within fashion history or social history and social change and the knitting industry in Shetland itself. So it's been a really big research project, really, because it's taken me in a lot of different directions, but it's been absolutely fascinating. So all 27 pieces have got something to say, I believe, about
the social or history
fashion
or knitting history. Great. Okay. Because I do want to talk about Fair Isle, because often we have the perception that Fair Isle is a technique that is very traditional. It's been around for a very long time and it's got very set rules. But interestingly, you found some techniques that we consider to be very modern now used in these vintage garments. So can you talk to us or share with us some of the most surprising things that you found, techniques or constructions, and then maybe some conclusions that you drew from it?
Yes, certainly. The first one I'll show you is this one, which actually is one of the oldest pieces in the book as well, which is what makes it even more interesting. And this is a long tunic style, as you can see, which again in the 1920s was a very common shape. But what is uncommon about this is the construction. It started at the back at this point and knitted upwards and then comes straight over the shoulder, and the two sides are knitted separately. But these panels are actually done as a combination of Fair Isle and Intarsia rather than all Fair Isle. Which, so if
and it's very trendy with this crossover top, isn't it?
It really is. But if we just look at a little bit of the back there, you can see it's Fair Isle across the individual motifs. But we don't carry beyond those motifs. So I've seen this in the 1940s, but I'd never seen it as far back as the 1920s. And from what I can tell, this is pretty much the only one in the archive. There doesn't seem to be another one where somebody adopted these techniques. I mean, there might have been, but there isn't one in the archive. But it's such an unusual thing. And then, of course, we've then got side seams because it's knitted as a long piece.
It is, isn't it?
And then it's picked up on the sleeves and they're worked downwards. But even so, again, they are then knitted in intarsia sections. And then it's only when you get down to this welt that these are picked up and knitted in the round as full Fair Isle.
It's such a beautiful garment, and it is so 1920s, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. And the lady who wore it is a really influential and important person in Shetland women's suffrage history. So it's quite a significant piece because of the person who wore it as well. Then this one is on a much, much smaller scale, and it is this lovely little beret here. But I don't know whether you can see or not, but these Fair Isle panels run this way.
So and they've been knitted across that way.
And then the stocking stitch panels are knitted this way. So it took quite a while for me to figure out quite how it was done. So you actually start at one end of one of these Fair Isle panels and you do a provisional cast on. And then you knit your little panel back and forth, so I'm afraid there are purl rows. And then you cast on a little stocking stitch panel, and then you can see there's a lot of shaping going on in these little panels as well. And then you pick up onto your Fair Isle panel as you go. Then when you finish that one, you pick up your Fair Isle panel off that
Okay.
and knit this way, and so on till you get back to the beginning.
Right. And then do you do this at the very end?
You do.
You keep your live stitches here,
That's right.
and then you'd pick up. So you've got live stitches on all the plain sections,
it.
and then you go round.
You do.
Lovely.
And then likewise you pick up at the bottom to do your
Yeah.
little rib band. But again, this was quite a fascinating piece in the museum. The original one of this was actually pieces that were sort of sewn together and cut and things. So I decided that asking people to cut the knitting up into strips and then sew it all back together might not be that popular.
I would do it.
So I found a more
Yes.
organic and intuitive way of putting it together. But
That's it's very fancy though, isn't it?
It is. It's quite, and this was a prize winner. It's interesting. There's quite a lot in the book that actually won prizes for one reason or another,
Yeah.
either in local or national competitions.
Because you were saying earlier to me that the knitters early on had a lot of input from the outside world on fashion magazines and people coming and, to holiday in Shetland.
Oh yes,
So they
yeah,
really
they
knew
did.
what was going on in the
They
fashion
did, and
world.
they were very experimental. Yes, when they were knitting for their own creative reasons rather than for their commercial reasons, is the best way to put it. They very much used that as a reason to experiment, to try out techniques and to try and recreate the things that they'd seen
In magazines.
or on
Using their own designs.
visitor, or
Yeah.
and see how they could merge Fair Isle techniques with contemporary fashion.
Yeah, and shapes.
Yeah.
So it's very organic. They were very intuitive and just trying to do whatever they could with whatever they had at hand.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. And if you think about it, in the 1920s and 30s, Fair Isle was new. Fair Isle was big news. It was actually a fashion craze then, we see it now as such a traditional way of knitting. In the 1920s, it was high fashion.
Yeah.
And it was,
Because of the Prince of Wales.
Exactly. Yes, he appeared on the golf course in his Fair Isle jumper, and the rest is history. But that did generate such an incredible interest in Fair Isle worldwide.
Yeah.
And it pushed what had been the traditional Shetland knitting, which was lace,
Okay.
out, and people just no longer
Right.
knitted lace. Everybody knitted Fair
Isle.
Isle. And there were people knitting 18 hours a day just to try and keep up with orders. So
Yeah.
it was an incredibly
Economic push, actually, for the
it
island.
was, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Great. So there's one more over there.
well, I'll show you this one. This I find particularly fascinating because on the surface, it is the archetypal sort of 1920s all over Fair Isle cardigan that we imagine. It's got its beautiful little corrugated rib,
Yes.
button band and welt. It's got these nifty little pockets,
Very cute.
which were often there for your golf tee. That was sort of their original purpose,
Okay.
because these were seen as sporting clothing.
Yeah.
But the one thing it has got, which is really, I couldn't get over it when I found them, but if we have a look at these sleeve heads here, these again then picked up and knitted in the round and knitted downwards.
It's a set in... No, it's not quite a set in sleeve.
It's not really. It's a slight drop, really. But then if we see here, to create the sleeve head, we actually have a whole series of short rows worked very, very neatly between the pattern rows.
Yeah.
So it doesn't impact on your Fair Isle pattern whatsoever, but it just creates that nice little bit of shape in the sleeve head and that extra bit of room to be able to manoeuvre your shoulders about swinging the golf club on the golf course. But I just think that in particular is just such a lovely little
It is,
touch.
and you love it. I love it when you have to really look for something.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then you see
You don't know.
A hidden secret.
I didn't even really see it till I started to translate
you can see
the
it
jumper.
perhaps there a bit easier.
Yeah, you can.
because you can see,
There's a slight sort of
Yes.
angle on that, isn't there? That,
and here as
Yeah.
well. Wasn't that amazing? There is lots more in part 2 of our interview with Susan Crawford, but it's just like when you're enjoying a really good meal. It's good to have a break in between the courses so that you can truly savour the experience.
Have a chat and a glass of wine, dolls.
Yeah. So it was actually a real treat for me to be able to spend some time with Susan and see in person her dedication and passion for researching, studying and recording the past generation of Shetland knitters and their amazing knitting skills through these garments, and then all of the countless hours that it took to resize these garments and make them available for the modern knitter. So it's really people like Susan who totally go for their passion, spend the hours and hours that is needed to do something like this, that really give us an extra layer of enrichment and beauty in the art or craft of knitting.
Yeah, and keep these things alive. I think it's really great.
Yeah.
To celebrate the work that Susan has put into the collection and into the book itself, we are starting the Vintage Shetland Cowl. The rules are very simple. It has to be a design from the collection, and modifications are acceptable, which is in the spirit of the Shetland knitters themselves.
That's true. Yeah. So if you fall in love with one of the vests and you want to make it a jumper, then you can just add sleeves on it, or if you want to make one of the jumpers a cardigan, you can convert it. So that's all fine, because that's exactly what the Shetland knitters did themselves. Yeah. It's quite exciting. I don't know what design I want to knit first.
No, you're still checking them out.
Yeah.
Susan has very kindly offered a discount to our patrons on any of the yarn kits for any of the designs in the Vintage Shetland collection. So you can check that out, find out all the details on Patreon, our Patreon page. That applies to sales via their online shop. So Susan Crawford, vintage.com.
Yep.
We'll have all the details on Patreon, and yeah, I think it's a really generous discount.
It's a lovely offer, so that's exciting.
Yep.
Yeah. Next up, I'm going to give you a little update on my 10-year design, which is a design by Caitlin Hunter. It has been on the back burner. I haven't done a lot with it, but I did want to mention a modification that I made on the neckline that I didn't say last time. So as I've said a few times, I've turned this design, which originally was in a summer design, into a winter design. Part of that was changing the neckline because it was quite low. I've made mine higher and wider, so it's more like a boat neckline, boat shape. And the design has this very cute little curly stocking stitch edging on the neckline. And stocking stitch will naturally curl because the knit stitches are shorter than the purl stitches, so it'll always curl in like this. And the design has the curling outwards like that. So it'll curl, you pick up stitches, you knit with the right side facing, you knit, and it'll naturally curl like that. I decided to do it the other way, so I turned my garment inside out, so I had the purl side facing me, and then I did my little stocking stitch edge, and when it curls in towards me. So if you have a look at there, it's curling in, and I think that gives it a very neat finish. It's the same look, but it's in my opinion a little bit neater because it's curling inwards. So I'm very happy with that.
Right. Dolls, listen, I have to ask, because there have been a few incidents recently. This was a deliberate change.
Was it? Yes.
Yeah. It wasn't just that you were knitting with the thing inside out and
didn't realise.
And
no.
We're just couldn't face any more ripping back.
No.
Okay. All right.
No, it was a deliberate change.
Okay.
So this lovely design has short sleeves on it because it's summer, as I've said, so I've changed mine into long sleeves. Here's a sleeve completely done. I just have to sew it in. And the other little bit of fun thing I did was add a little frill or a ruffle on the cuff like this. So here it is there. It's looking very cute, I think. It's actually a lot of fun to add ruffles to things. You can add them to all kinds of edges. You can add them to necklines, to hems, to cuffs. Down the front, you could add them to a scarf, accessories, hats, cushions. So I thought I'd make just a little tutorial to show you how to make a ruffle so that you can have some fun with frills yourself.
Get some frills into your life.
Yes. Yeah. to show you how I made this curly edge ruffle on my sleeve. You could use the same idea for a hemline, a neckline, down the front of a cardigan or jacket, or even on a shawl or around the edge of a cushion. And once you know how it's done, you could make a lot of variations on it using the same principle. And in my case, I worked the sleeve bottom up, so I started with 4 times the amount of stitches that were needed for the width of my sleeve cuff, and then decreased to half the amount in the first row, and then half the amount again in the second row. So for example, if you need 50 stitches for the width of your cuff, you cast on 200 stitches. In the first row you decrease down to 100 stitches, and in the second row you decrease down to 50 stitches. If you're working your knitting in the other direction, you would start with 50 stitches, increase to 100 stitches on the next row, and increase again to 200 stitches on the following row. And doing exactly that is what makes this very small curly edging. So if you want to have more of a deeper frill or ruffle, you would just increase or decrease, depending on which direction you're knitting, over more rows and at a slower rate. So you can see that there's endless possibilities. You can create this kind of frill or edge in the flat or in the round, but I'm going to show you how to work it flat. There's going to be a lot of stretch because the edging of the frill has at least double, if not 4 times the amount of stitches as the main section of the knitting. So to keep it really neat, I did my curly edges on much smaller needles than the main body. So the main body of the sleeve is worked on 3.25mm or US size 3, and the edging is worked on 2.25mm or US size 1. So here are my stitches, which I've cast on using the long tail method. And my first row is a knit row, and I always knit the first and the last stitches on the row to keep the edges more even and neat. It makes seaming a lot easier. And then I'll do the decreases on the in-between stitches. I've knit my outside stitch, and now I'm going to knit 2. It's 1, 2, and I just simply lift this first stitch over the second knitted stitch and off. Okay, so that's how I'm going to decrease. And I'm just simply going to do that right across the row. So I knit 2 stitches and then lift the first stitch over the top of the second one. I've finished this row now, and you can see how the stitches are quite spread out because I've decreased every second stitch. That's what it looks like. If you're going to be knitting in the round, then your second row you would just go and do knit 2 together all across the row. Because I'm knitting flat, I'm going to turn over and I've got a purl row. So again, to keep my edges neat, I always knit the first and the last stitch, even on a purl side row. So I'm going to knit the first one, and now I'm going to purl 2 together right across the row. And I'm making sure that I'm doing it quite tightly so that it ends up a really nice tight curl and it's not sloppy. I've finished my purl row. I'm down to the correct number of stitches that I need for my sleeve. I've changed up my needle size and done a couple of rows already. You can see that with the correct size needle, and you can see this little curtain fringe. It's very cute looking. Because I did it on a small size needle, it's quite tight and neat, which is what you want. So I hope this has inspired you to play around and put a cute little frilly edge on something, a hem or a sleeve or a neckline or an accessory, and have some fun.
And I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis is in the middle of the United States, and it's known for the gateway to the West. I started knitting about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was in a doctor's office, and they told me I had a very advanced, late-stage, highly aggressive cancer, and I needed to start chemotherapy the next day. Well, immediately I heard wah, 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 wah. I couldn't hear anything else the doctors were telling me. My mind just checked out. And I started thinking, I never learned how to knit. So we went to the car. My husband started thinking, what are the next steps? And I told him the next steps are we need to go to a knit shop today. And we picked my daughter up, who was in 5th grade at the time, and we went to a local knit shop. And the instructor there, Ariel, was amazing. And we told her we would like to learn how to knit. And she said, we have classes available you can sign up for, and we can get you started. But I explained to her, we need to learn how to knit today. And we want to learn how to knit socks. And she said, are you sure you want to learn how to knit socks as your first project? And both my daughter and I said, yes, that's what we want to learn how to knit. I don't know why that was, but we wanted to learn how to knit that. And she picked out the wool, and we started knitting in the round that day and ended up with part of a sock. And we've been knitting socks ever since. So for about 7 years, we knit intarsia socks, cabled socks, which are lovely, lace cashmere socks, and colorwork socks. And we've really enjoyed the craft of knitting. I really think it was my lifeline that day, and from here on out, I just want to learn more and more and more about knitting. 2 years ago, I decided to start knitting garments. My friend James brought me a pattern back from Meg Swanson's knit camp. The name of the pattern is North African Pullover. I think this is such a lovely sweater. I love the design. I learned a lot about knitting. One of the things I learned was your row gauge needs to be spot on. And this ended up being a belly button sweater or midriff sweater. So I had to add on about 5 inches of a pattern. And I really found the creative process of that fun. I also added my initials in the year I finished. I really like that detail. The sweater is steeked. There were no additional steek stitches, so I had to learn how to machine secure the stitches and add my sleeve. All in all, it was a great learning process. I love the look of this sweater. The most important thing I learned was never block your garments on top of your washing machine. My son came home from university and did his laundry, and we were so thrilled. And when he pulled his clothes out of the dryer, he said, Mom, I think this is yours, and didn't realize that it felted or anything was wrong with it. I immediately knew what had happened, got my knitting needles and said thanks, and started knitting a 3rd sleeve. So now that's a running joke in our family that I have a 3-sleeve sweater. The next year I went to Meg's camp and fell in love with her giant Latvian mitten cardigan. It's knit with Jamieson's of Shetland spindrift wool. I just love this seamless effect with the body and the arm. This is steeked, but then you pick up in pattern to continue it down the arm. I did have to change the color of the bottom. The original pattern, the color is no longer available, and I like the choice. I like the maroon. I can wear it with black pants or jeans, and I really love this sweater. My latest project was test knitting Salmon Coming Home by Janine Bages. This uses 10 shades of Jamieson Shetland Spindrift. It has waist shaping, or you can knit it straight. It also has shoulder shaping in the round, which was a new technique that I learned. I really enjoyed that. The other thing I learned about this sweater was as you're knitting it, you see the fish come along, and it just puts a smile on your face. So it's a very fun knit. She was inspired by her teaching trip in Alaska and came home and made this pattern up. It shows the reflection of the mountains. And I just love the design of this pattern. Another pattern from Janine is Redbud Vest, and it has waist shaping and shoulder shaping. It's the same concept, different pattern, different colors. I really enjoy knitting vests so much that I knit 10 last year, and I wear them quite a bit. In St. Louis, our summers are brutally hot, and we have about 2.5 months of winter, 3 months of winter. So in the summertime or spring, when the air conditioning's on, you just throw a vest on and you're nice and cozy, and you can go to the market. So I think these are my new thing, are vests. Some of my favorite ones are Isolde's Brunsfield. I love the gray and the pink together. It's a very comfortable vest. And I love her Cruden. It has the rounded neck. The blue and the green look so cute together with a pop of yellow. And I'm just really looking forward to the journey ahead. I love meeting knitters and traveling and going to workshops. I really appreciate all the designers out there. Some of my favorites are Marie Wallen, Sitzel Hoivik, Kate Davies. Ella Gordon puts a smile on my face. And I'm just going to continue this journey. So if you see me out there, say hi. And thank you for having me.
Thank you very much to Karen from St. Louis. It was totally our privilege to present Karen and to showcase her beautiful work.
Yeah.
I found her story really inspiring. It's amazing to see how a real life-changing event like a serious illness can focus your mind on what you really want, and how Karen just took that on totally. Her knitting obviously became a real support for her during her treatment, and you can just see what a passion it has turned into with the beautiful projects that she has there. I have to say, I've really got my eye on those salmon.
That is an amazing vest. It is a stunning design.
Yeah, so eye-catching,
Yeah.
So
yeah, I want to knit it, and I've been thinking about, because I don't like to knit a vest or a pattern twice, and I'm thinking, well, I would really like it myself, but then it would look really cool on you.
Yeah.
So
I can see this could turn a little bit difficult, but thank you very much to Karen for sharing your story with us.
yes, thank you. We would like to ask you, if you're watching and enjoying our show, to please support it by becoming a patron. We've now produced a very large collection of great interviews and tutorials and lots of other segments, all of which take an enormous amount of work.
Yep.
It's only through the financial support of our patrons that I'm able to work full-time to produce this show. So it only takes the cost of a couple of coffees per month to become a patron. So if you're enjoying it, we ask you to please become a patron. Thank you.
Coming up now is part 2 of our interview with Susan Crawford, and this really is a beautiful conversation.
Yeah, so she shows us a lot more about the garments, which is really exciting, and she also talks a little bit about her recovery from cancer, which is very inspiring.
Yeah.
So you'll really enjoy that. Thank you for spending time with us again, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. In case you're wondering, I'm wearing the Mary Tudor from the Tudor Roses book by Alice Starmore.
Yeah, and I'm wearing the Firebirds, modified to fit me and not a little girl, by Jade Starmore. Thanks for being with us today. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, well, I know that the viewers really want to hear you talk about some more of the designs that are in the book. So, what else can you show us?
Okay, this is one of my favourites from the book. This is a 1950s cardigan, and it's in one of the sort of quintessential 1950s motifs, which is the rose, which, for those of you who are vintage knitting fans, will know it appears so much in a very, very short period of time. It's just everywhere. But this was the garment really that meant that I had to create a second line of yarn.
Okay.
Because this one has distinctly unique colours, and it's also done in what was a vintage 3-ply weight. Now, I've talked about this before, but vintage 3-ply is thicker than our 2-ply lace weight, but it's thinner than our fingering or 4-ply. And again, they are beginning to become available now, but when I first started doing this project, there was no example of 3-plies about. So I called on my friend John again, and we actually came up with Fenella, which is this rather beautiful yarn. And one of the other problems was, as you can see, these really sort of 50s colours that really pop in the cardigan.
Yeah.
And I had these colours specially made to be able to reproduce the cardigan, the rose cardigan as it's called and should be called because it's covered in roses. One of the other really interesting things about it is its construction. Up on the shoulders, it's got this lovely example of continuous ferrule here. And actually the seam for joining the front and the back together is along this edge here. So the front is actually knitted longer than the back, and then you join it together, but always on the shoulder you have this lovely uninterrupted line of roses, which is I think is just such a beautiful design detail, and one that you could so easily miss yet again, because it's so perfect you just don't even see it. And then it's also got these lovely little puff sleeves as well, more subtle than sometimes, but just really nicely
just slightly
done.
gathered.
Yeah. And if you look at the sleeve and the body here, you'll see it's actually continuous as well.
Yeah.
So it's actually a yoke, but it gives the illusion of a set-in sleeve.
So it's a yoke here. It's got some shaping down the bottom half, and then a bit of shaping up here.
You sort of separate it here, and you knit your little puff sleeve separately, and you knit your last little bit of the shoulder separately.
So that's really unusual construction.
It's really unusual and really interesting. The original garment actually hasn't got proper sleeves either, so I've had to sort of make an educated guess that the sleeves would probably have been elbow length, as that was the style at the time. But they've actually been cut off because they've worn out and it's been hacked to become different things.
Lovely.
But that one is a particularly beautiful example.
And the diamonds here.
Yeah, again, it's a traditional pattern, but it became such an iconic 1950s and early 60s pattern. It was resurrected and very, very common on the sort of more traditional yoke, but used so effectively here just to break the patterns up. And you've got this lovely sort of trailing vine Peary motif as well in the middle, which is quite difficult to do from number of sizes because it's asymmetric and it's such a big pattern repeat as well. So that one caused its own challenges.
You would have learned so much through doing this. You've got so many challenges to make them all look authentic throughout all of the sizes.
Yes.
And you've just learned so much by seeing and analysing how these things were made.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
That.
Yeah. The reading of the patterns has been particularly fascinating, and suddenly having that eureka moment when you realise how they've actually constructed it, which leads me, I will show you this one next, which is a slightly earlier one. This one is from the 1940s, and this was by a lady called Ethel Henry, who was a hairdresser in Shetland, but also designed And generally to commission, she would knit
Okay.
one-off pieces for people, and she would wear a lot of pieces herself, and then people would see her wearing them in the hairdressers and they would ask her to make one. But this one, again, it looks quite standard in some ways. You've got your corrugated rib and then you've got your nice repeating motifs. What's really nice about this is that every one of these little peries is different.
Yeah.
But again, this shoulder line was really quite fascinating. As this was the 1940s, Ethel was obviously trying to get the puff sleeve that was so popular in the 40s. But she knitted the entire body in the round.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I can tell on the inside of the original, she's then used scissors to cut the satin sleeve shape. So she hasn't done any shaping in terms of decreasing stitches.
Yeah.
She's literally cut it away and created a sleeve head shape.
Yeah, it's a mixture of sewing and knitting, really.
Exactly, yeah. So I haven't done that because, again, I thought people might shout at me if I say just take your scissors and try and make a sleeve head shape randomly. So we have now put decreases into the pattern.
Yeah.
But it was just amazing to see somebody, you're actually witnessing their creative
Their thought
processes, trying to figure out how to make a modern shape fit traditional techniques.
Yeah.
And that has just been
That would
so,
be so
interesting.
exciting. I could absolutely understand that.
She also, Ethel, did wonderful little sort of almost punky design touches and used these really heavy metal zips.
That's so modern now.
Yeah, it is. It's fantastic. And they really were. They weren't subtle zips. They were, I think hers is actually a bit chunkier than this one, but it's, they were really, really noticeable. They were there to be a feature, not to be discreet. Yes, that's one of my real favourites, I think, Ethel's, just because of those. I just love the idea of her just taking the scissors to something that's taken all this effort and just...
Yeah, so she's
let's see if it
confident.
works.
She's confident.
And yet she didn't quite get it right because on the inside, again, it's sort of folded over a couple of times and then sort of stitched up. But it gives a lovely bit of support to the puff sleeve, actually.
Exactly, yeah. Or maybe even a little bit shoulder paddy.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Very exciting. Okay.
And then this one is much more traditional, but this one has an amazing story. This is... I call it the prisoner of war jumper. But this was knitted by a lady called Doris Hunter, who was the fiancée of a gentleman called Ralph Patterson. And Ralph was an engineer during the Second World War, and he was in Hong Kong. And he was there when the island was invaded in Christmas Day 1941, and he got taken prisoner, and he spent the next 4 years in Stanley prisoner of war camp, which was quite an atrocious place to find yourself. And it just so happened that when he was taken prisoner with his sweater.
Yeah.
And he wore his original of this throughout his incarceration. It's an extremely moving garment to look at, and certainly to get to touch and to read. It's very, very heavily darned. Almost every part of it is darned, and with very short little lengths of thread.
Okay.
And in my mind's eye, I just see him following other people in the camp and seeing a loose thread off their clothes and sort of helping himself to it so he could repair his jumper.
And he's linked to home.
Yeah, and he actually has written and said that this was, his
kept him
link.
going.
It kept him going. Yeah, and
Very moving,
it really is a quite special piece, really. And when I was reading this one, we were in the archive, and it was a sunny day, but the blinds were down because these things have to be protected. And I was sitting there and I thought, oh, am I getting a cold? I was beginning to wheeze. I was getting a sore throat. Then my nose started to run. Then my eyes started to run and then my skin was itching. I thought, this is really, really odd. And then even though the blind was down, the sun shone through the blind. And as it did so, I could just see hundreds and hundreds of fibres just coming up in the air. And I'd been breathing them in.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so little bits of Ralph's jumper actually
Had come into
had
you.
come into me, and I just
In more ways than one.
yeah, I just burst into tears. I was in
Yeah.
such a state at the very thought of it, you know.
Yeah.
So this one has been a real special experience, really, and
Yeah.
really has.
And especially because it is natural fibre, you think of it as being living, don't you, anyway?
Yes.
And then having had that life and having so much emotion, you know, and that time that man was wearing it you really do feel like it is just collected memories and life, and
It really, really did. And I mean, of course, they are living, and they are, and at the same time, they are decaying.
Exactly.
And by doing this project, I hope that, you know, when they are gone, at least we have a permanent record, both of the garments, but also of the stories that go with those garments.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm trying not to give too much away.
Yes.
Because obviously the stories are there in the book.
Exactly.
But,
yes.
That is a very, very special garment,
Right.
that one.
Well, we've got time for one more, and that's
Okay.
looking interesting over there.
Well,
the
I think I will just
shiny
share
one.
this one with you, because this one, again, a real labour of love, really, this one, in terms of its creation. This is Jeannie Johnson's sleeveless pullover, and anybody who's been to Shetland will probably have seen this jumper, even if they don't remember that they've seen it, but it's been featured heavily on the Shetland Museum's notebooks. You can buy a postcard with the sweater on the front and all sorts of things. It's become a really, really well-known piece, but very little was known about Jeannie. And in fact, the picture in the museum that used to be used to display this garment, the lady pictured in it, we used to assume was Jeannie, and in actual fact, it isn't.
Okay.
But we have now found.
You've
who
found Jeannie.
was. We
Okay.
have, yes. So all will be revealed. But so Jeannie used artificial silk, which is what used to be the name given to rayon, which is viscose, basically. So the original was this same sort of type of sheen and smoothness and drape, and these beautiful sort of very, very different colours to what a Shetland wool would have been, particularly in the early 1930s. They wouldn't have had probably these sort of colours. Jeannie had her own shop, so it's quite likely that she might have been stocking these rayons, but it's not something I'll ever be able to
know for sure.
Yeah. But she knitted this one and entered it in a Daily Mail knitting competition, which is the national newspaper here in the UK. And the prizes were quite phenomenal.
Okay.
And she won the equivalent of £500 for a third place.
Wow.
Which was this.
It's worth
this
doing your
sweater.
best
It
effort.
really was,
Yeah.
yeah. And she entered a lot of competitions, but this, I think, is for me one of her most spectacular pieces.
That's beautiful there.
It is, and yet again, I'm not 100% convinced that wasn't because of a design mistake.
Okay.
Because there's no shaping in the neck.
So she thinks this is sort of falling out. I
Flopping.
better do a bit.
I'll fold it over and put some buttons on.
Exactly. Do some tucks here. This is just how my grandmother would have done things.
Might not be the case, but it's certainly what I'd have done if I'd have gone wrong.
Yeah.
Because she was a very pragmatic lady. She wouldn't have wanted to waste all those hours of work. And she did complain that the rayon actually cut her fingers and gave her blisters and corns because it was so hard.
Yeah.
So I think the knitting experience had not been a particularly pleasurable one for her.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot easier with real silk, to be honest, and that's what this is.
You've got some silk things here.
Yeah.
So let's have a look.
We've got a very limited number of the yarns that this one was made from, So a friend of mine who was a hand dyer spent about a year getting the colours exact to match the original, and that's what these are. So you can see it's got such incredible sheen.
It does.
Which is exactly what the rayon would have had.
That just looks so vintage.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Looks like I've just pulled it out of a chest.
Yeah.
cupboard of my grandma's.
Yeah. And she actually, just to make it really hard, she actually uses 3 shades of sort of golds and yellows. So
Yes, but that's what gives it that luminescence.
it's beautiful and tonal, but yeah, I had to create 3 separate yellows to be able to recreate it. But it really is a very, 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 very special piece.
It is. Well, I can see that you have really put your whole heart into this and the development of this book and what you've done. And thank you so much, because I know that a lot of people are just going to really value reading the book and making the garments and learning so much about it.
I do hope so.
I can just sitting here now in the time that I have and just being able to see the garments, and I'm sure through reading the books people will feel the same. You can see more possibilities that you can do with your own knitting.
Yes.
And it's great to have all of this put into a book like a living history, isn't it? So
It is.
Thank you so much for doing that.
Pleasure.
We have to finish soon, but I want to quickly change the topic and to talk a little bit about your most recent experiences, because, as I said before, you've been a huge inspiration to both women and men in the crafting community through your honest and direct and open writings about your journey through breast cancer and your mastectomy. And recently, Susan has helped in the publication of a glossy journal called Scarlett's Knockerjotter. And this contains short diagnostic and treatment biographies of 16 women with photos of themselves before, during and after their treatment. And so I thought, could you talk us through very quickly a bit about the journey, and then tell us what it meant to you to be part of a project like this?
Certainly. Obviously, if you have followed me on Instagram, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, stage 3 breast cancer, in July of last year. It was a very sudden move from diagnosis straight into chemotherapy, hair loss, all those things that come with treatment. I found it almost impossible to keep quiet, and used Instagram heavily, really, to release my feelings of how I was feeling, but also I found it quite hard to find answers to questions. It was all okay if it was a medical question, but if it was something more, if it was about feelings or your appearance or your hair or all those sort of things, I found it quite difficult to find anything. So I talked a lot about those things that I needed answers to, and when I found answers I also shared. I was quite brutally open with some of the pictures that I shared, but again I found that really important to me, because when I was making decisions about what surgery to have, I found it quite hard to find photographs and true representations of what it would be like afterwards, really. There was also quite a lot of emphasis on assuming I would want reconstruction.
Okay.
The idea that you might not want reconstruction was almost seen as something strange.
Okay.
And at one point they actually suggested I would need counselling before I would be allowed to not have reconstruction.
Okay. Yeah.
Which,
very interesting.
Yeah, it seems so, and that really got me thinking about the whole sort of body image and how certain things are seen as the norm, to the extent that they can't imagine anybody could not want surgery
or
to
that they
put
think
them
it's an
back.
unhealthy thing not to want it.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So I wrote quite a treatise that I gave to my breast cancer nurse to sort of try and explain that my thoughts behind my decisions. I think what helped me have the strength to do all these things was that I was very lucky that we have a local organisation called Cancer Care here in Lancaster that is a local independent charity that provides holistic and complementary therapies and also counselling services to both the patients and all their family and their carers and even friends who were helping them through the journey. And that is all free at point of service. So you can go and make use of these amazing services, all free of charge.
Yeah.
But what they also did was give you other people to talk to who had gone through the same thing. And a group of the ladies is basically who became the Scarlets and the Knockajotter. So all 16 ladies in here are connected with the cancer care charity. We have all used their services in one way or another.
Yeah.
The lady on the front here, Andrea, she had the idea about doing the Jotter, but couldn't figure out where they would do photographs. So I was having a conversation with her about it and said, come to the farm. It's private. It's
a beautiful location.
It's a beautiful location. Come and use the farm. So we then had a weekend where 16 ladies, all at, as you say, different stages of their surgery or their chemotherapy or somewhere on the journey, came to the farm and had their photographs taken. And I have to say, it was the most life-transforming experience that I had. Everybody shared everything that they'd gone through. There was tears of joy, there was tears of sadness, there was so much laughter, and just the most heartbreaking, but then also life-affirming things shared that I don't think I could ever experience another 3 days like it, to be honest with you. There were people who were extremely fearful about having their photographs taken. And every single person did it. We all supported each other and everybody felt better at the end of it. So that was really what went into the Knockajotter. And I felt it was important to have a photograph taken where I felt beautiful and I felt secure and confident. So I was very lucky. I was able to pick my spot, and I picked a spot down in my fields with my sheep all around me, and I was able to take the photograph showing my mastectomy scars, and yet I felt it just showed other women that we are not freaks or we're not normal just because we're not any longer put together the same way as everybody else.
That is so important.
Yeah.
That is so important, and that's great. And so is this may I have a look in it?
Yes, of course, yeah.
So this is like a journal. It's got a lot of open pages for people to write into.
Yes, yeah.
That's the idea for people to have it as like their own diary. And
that's right, yes, yeah. And I suppose just a bit of positivity and...
Yeah.
Yes, I suppose it could be seen as distressing because it's...
But it's part of the story, though.
It is, yeah.
It is part of the story. And I think it's wonderful that you have been so open about it, because otherwise it's always this dark spot in people's imagination. They think, oh, if that ever happened to me, what would it be like?
Exactly.
And here you can, if it's not happening to you or if it's happening to someone you love, you've got real information. You've got women's experiences that you can lean on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
thank you so much. You have done so much for people in so many ways. So thank you. And I know that the viewers will also be saying thank you. I'm getting all teary. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I know that people are going to be so excited about this book that comes out and everything you've done. So thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. And thank you, everybody.
We'll say goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.